Why was her name still glowing on the encrypted screen, 3 weeks after her funeral? The lieutenant colonel didn't move for several seconds. The room around him buzzed with soft chatter, the hum of computers, the faint crackle of a secure radio line, but his eyes were locked on one thing, an 11-second pulse, coded and authentic, coming from a device that shouldn't exist anymore. The call sign read Sierra November 41. Staff Sergeant Brin Halford. Deceased. He whispered the word as if it might correct the screen, but the line didn't fade. The signal repeated once, short, crisp, encrypted to NATO standard, carrying the unmistakable fingerprint of a U.S. Army-issued personnel beacon. Her beacon. It wasn't possible. Brin had been buried with honors in Arlington less than a month ago. Her name carved into stone, her mother handed a folded flag, her platoon standing in quiet rows as taps drifted across the autumn field. The paperwork had cleared every level, from battlefield confirmation to DNA verification. There had been photos, speeches, a folded uniform under glass. Every part of the system had agreed. She was gone. And yet the signal said otherwise. "Confirm beacon ID," the colonel ordered quietly. The tech at the console nodded, fingers racing over keys. "Confirmed, sir. Serial number matches inventory logs. Issued to Halford Brin M., Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army Counterintelligence. Encrypted to her personal code." The colonel's jaw tightened. "Run frequency origin. Eastern Afghanistan. Coordinates tracking north by northwest. Movement confirmed, sir. She's mobile." Mobile. That word hung in the air like a heartbeat. Someone whispered, "She was KIA in the Hindu Kush." Nobody answered. Outside, the night over Bagram was still, broken only by the rumble of distant aircraft and the low thunder of rotors circling the airfield. Inside the operations center, every sound seemed sharper, more deliberate, the sound of disbelief turning into urgency. 3 weeks ago, the Army had told her mother she was gone. That same morning, 2 officers and a chaplain had driven down a long gravel road in rural Oregon. They parked outside a small farmhouse surrounded by pines and mist. Brin's mother, Margaret, had opened the door before they even knocked. She'd seen that look before. She'd grown up in a military family. She didn't scream. She didn't faint. She simply nodded as if she had always known this moment would come. They told her what they could, that her daughter's team had gone missing during a link-up operation near the Pakistan border, that enemy contact had occurred, that remains had been recovered and identified. It all sounded official, structured, complete. She accepted the folded flag, listened to the chaplain's prayer, watched the casket lower into the earth, surrounded by quiet strangers in uniform. Somewhere, a rifle volley cracked through the air and a bugle cried out across the grass. And then she went home. Back in Afghanistan, the colonel was already on the line with higher command. The chain moved fast now. JC, NSA liaisons, Special Operations Command. Because if this signal was real, then everything from battlefield identification to mortuary affairs had failed in the worst way imaginable. Within hours, the information reached Naval Special Warfare Development Group, operating in Nangarhar Province. A SEAL reconnaissance element already conducting operations nearby was tasked with immediate diversion. Find the signal source. Confirm or deny presence of U.S. personnel. They didn't yet know that the personnel they were chasing had been alone in the mountains for 21 days. Brin Halford had grown up far from battlefields, deep in the Cascade foothills, where snow fell heavy and winters taught people to be still. Her grandfather had taught her how to track elk, how to move without sound, how to read terrain the way others read books. He'd been one of those quiet Vietnam veterans who never talked about the war, but carried it in his eyes. When she was a kid, she'd ask him why he still walked the woods alone every morning. He'd just smile and say, "Because the land doesn't lie." By 15, she could navigate by stars, make fire from damp wood, and follow animal prints across frozen creeks without losing them. When her grandfather died 2 years later, she joined the army. It wasn't rebellion, it was gravity. At 23, she'd already completed counterintelligence training and volunteered for Ranger School. 2 recycles, 2 failures, but she came back both times, passed on the third. Her instructors remembered her not for strength but for refusal. That kind of persistence leaves a mark. And somewhere along the way, she became the kind of soldier who didn't talk much. But when she did, people listened. Her last deployment had been routine at first: intel gathering, source cultivation, deep field operations near Paktika. She spoke enough Pashto to blend in as a translator when needed. Locals trusted her. She had a face that didn't demand attention and eyes that saw more than they revealed. Her final mission was supposed to last one night. Meet a high-value source with intel on Taliban troop movements. Extract before dawn. Nothing dramatic. But plans only last until first contact. The source never arrived. Instead, an enemy patrol stumbled across their position near a dry riverbed. The after-action report, written later by men who weren't there, claimed all 3 members of her team were killed instantly in the firefight. A crash site confirmed. Wreckage recovered. The bodies burned beyond recognition. Her name went on a list, a file closed. What nobody knew was that Brin had woken up half a kilometer from the wreckage. Her shoulder was dislocated, ribs torn open, uniform soaked in blood. Her radio was destroyed. The wreckage had already been stripped by Taliban fighters, the bodies taken for propaganda. She had no team, no support, no extraction. She could have activated her beacon that first night, but she knew better. An active beacon meant attention from both sides. The Taliban monitored those frequencies. If they caught the pulse, she'd be a target before anyone could help. So she stayed silent. She treated her wounds the way she'd been trained. Reduced the shoulder against a tree trunk, packed the lacerations with cloth from her undershirt, tied her arm in a sling made from duct tape and webbing. She ate sparingly, moved only at night, drank from cold streams that cut through the mountains like veins. And she kept walking. One night turned into 3, 3 turned into 7. Her sense of time dissolved. Hunger blurred the days, but the promise she'd made to her grandfather, never quit, echoed louder than the pain. Back at Bagram, nobody knew any of this. To the world, she was already dead. But Petty Officer Garrett Lond, a SEAL Team 6 signals analyst, had a habit of double-checking routine intercepts. Boredom breeds curiosity. 3 weeks after her supposed death, he found a short, encrypted burst, a distress code buried inside a digital sweep of the Hindu Kush. The signature matched a personnel beacon serial. He almost ignored it. Devices sometimes got spoofed or reactivated by enemy forces, but something about the encryption caught his eye. It was clean, unbroken, authentic. He checked the serial against the logistics database. When her name appeared, he froze. He rechecked it 3 times. Then he walked straight into his commanding officer's office. "Sir, you need to see this." Lieutenant Commander Vance read the file silently. Then he called Joint Command. Within minutes, the word spread. A classified distress ping from a soldier declared KIA moving in Taliban territory. The data didn't lie. If she was captured, she wouldn't be mobile. If she was injured, she wouldn't have moved 12 kilometers in 48 hours. The only possibility left was the one nobody wanted to say aloud. She was alive. Somewhere in those mountains, Brin Halford was still moving. JC authorized a recon element immediately. A SEAL team already operating nearby was redirected. No public record, no media, no leaks. This was about finding the truth quietly and fast. Because the implications were massive. If Brin was alive, Then someone else's remains had been sent home under her name. It meant a breakdown in identification, in chain of custody, in trust. And the longer she stayed out there, the less chance she had of making it home again. Meanwhile, Brin climbed through the mountains, her body a map of pain. Her shoulders screamed every time she moved. She hadn't seen her reflection in days. Her uniform was torn, her hair caked with dirt, her boots shredded by stone. But she kept moving west, using the stars to guide her. The cold gnawed at her bones. She learned to sleep sitting up, half awake, pistol in hand. Sometimes she'd catch faint voices in the wind, enemy patrols searching. She'd hold her breath and count the seconds between footsteps. Fear became a rhythm, like breathing. On the 20th day, she reached a ridge overlooking a vast valley. Snow dusted the rocks like ash. She knew she couldn't last much longer. Her food was gone. Her strength was bleeding away. So she took a risk. She unpacked her beacon, held it close to her chest, and powered it on. The small light blinked red. She adjusted the antenna, entered her code, and let it transmit, just for 11 seconds. Then she shut it off. No more. If anyone was listening, that would be enough. If not, it didn't matter. For the first time in 3 weeks, she let herself hope. Back at Bagram, that faint pulse reached a computer in the operations room. And within 12 hours, a SEAL team was already in the air. 6 men moving into Black Mountains where ghosts were said to wander. They didn't know who they were looking for. Only that she'd once been declared dead. And that maybe, just maybe, the dead weren't done fighting. What does survival sound like after 3 weeks of silence? For Brin Halford, it was the crunch of frozen dirt beneath her boots and the whisper of breath that came slower each night. The mountains were merciless, razor-backed ridges, black valleys, air so thin it scraped the lungs. Every step was a wager, every pause a prayer. The beacon was off again, hidden deep inside her pack beneath a torn poncho liner. She had pressed that button for 11 seconds. If someone had heard it, they would come. If they hadn't, she would die here. There wasn't any middle ground left. The cold had eaten through her gloves. Her hands trembled when she tried to reload her sidearm, the last weapon she still trusted. The rifle had been lost in the crash. Her rations were gone. The only thing left was motion, the only thing that kept the dread from swallowing her. She thought often of her grandfather during those nights. His voice was a steady memory, calm even when the world broke apart. "The body gives up before the soul does," he used to say, "so keep your soul awake." She whispered those words when her legs began to shake. The mountains didn't care who she was, what medals she'd earned, or what flag she'd served under. They stripped her to the one truth she couldn't escape: survival is lonely. But far below, others were already moving. The SEAL team inserted under cover of darkness. A Black Hawk skimmed low over the ridges, its rotors barely audible above the wind. Inside, 6 operators sat silent, faces blacked out beneath night vision gear. Each man carried a different kind of focus, because they all knew what this was. They weren't rescuing a hostage, they weren't capturing a target, they were chasing a ghost. Senior Chief Ramos, the team leader, read the brief again during the flight, though he'd already memorized every word. Staff Sergeant Brin M. Halford, counterintelligence, presumed KIA, encrypted distress signal confirmed 3 weeks post-mortem, coordinates, active. He looked at the photo attached to the file. A young woman in fatigues, no makeup, hair tied back, eyes that carried more questions than answers. "She's been out there 3 weeks, one of the men muttered quietly, adjusting his comms gear. "If she's alive, she's built different." Ramos said nothing. He'd seen what 3 days could do to a soldier in the wild. 3 weeks bordered on impossible. But impossibility wasn't an argument, it was a mission. The helicopter banked hard over a ridge and dropped low. Green light washed the cabin. Ramos gave the signal. They jumped. The landing zone was narrow, a shelf of dirt barely big enough for 6 men and their gear. Once the rotors disappeared into the dark, silence swallowed everything. Only wind, only stars. "Comms check," Ramos whispered. One by one they confirmed secure, encrypted, clear. Then they began the climb. 15 kilometers north. No vehicles, no support. They moved by night, cutting through rock gullies, crawling across snow lines. Every few minutes they stopped and listened. Sometimes they could hear faint voices echoing from below, enemy patrols, maybe 30 strong, sweeping the valleys in tight formations. Someone else was searching too. Ramos didn't say it aloud, but he knew. The Taliban had seen the same beacon burst. They'd know it was American. They'd know someone out there was alive. Back at the forward operations base, the tactical screen pulsed with tiny moving blips. The text tracked the SEAL team's path through encrypted GPS relays, careful not to light up any frequencies that could expose them. The colonel from Bagram stood over the map, his jaw locked, his knuckles white on the table's edge. "Do they have confirmation of friendly contact?" he asked. "Negative," came the reply. "No visuals, no heat signatures, terrain's blocking most signals." "Then keep them dark," the colonel said. "We lose comms before we lose her." He didn't admit it aloud, but he hadn't stopped thinking about Brin since the signal appeared. Soldiers die in war, that's the reality. But being buried alive in paperwork and grief, declared gone when you're still breathing, that was a different kind of cruelty. He had a daughter the same age. Meanwhile, Brin was learning that hunger could teach patience better than any classroom. She had stopped counting days. Instead, she measured time by the wounds that healed and the ones that didn't. The gash across her ribs had begun to close, but it burned when she moved too fast. The shoulder she'd set against the tree trunk still throbbed with every step. The nights were long enough to break her, but she didn't break. There were moments, though, moments she hated herself for, when she wished she had just died in the crash. It would have been simpler, cleaner. Her family would have closure. The army would have one less ghost to explain. But then she'd look at the stars. She'd think of her mother sitting by that folded flag, and something in her chest would harden again. "Not yet." She whispered at every dawn, "Not yet." By the time the SEALs reached the first ridge, they were already in terrain that punished every movement. Thin air, frozen streams, the scent of wood smoke from distant valleys. Ramos called a halt and crouched near a rock shelf. He took out his scope and scanned the north slope. Nothing but snow and shadow. Then, faintly, ashes, a cold campfire. They approached in silence. Inside a shallow cave, they found the remains of a small fire pit. Beside it, a torn bandage, a strip of cloth that had once been part of a uniform undershirt. U.S. issue. Ramos' heart kicked once in his chest. "Get me that on record," he whispered. "She was here." "How long ago?" "Less than a day," one of the operators said, touching the ash. "Still warm underneath." That was all they needed. They moved again. Hours passed. The terrain grew crueler. They scaled narrow passes where one wrong step meant a 1,000-foot fall. Every so often, the wind carried the sharp crack of gunfire from far away, patrols skirmishing, search parties clashing with ghosts. By nightfall, they reached high ground. Below them, the valley glowed faintly under the moon. Two groups of Taliban fighters were moving in a slow grid, flashlights sweeping across the rock. Ramos raised his scope again. He didn't see her at first, just movement small, irregular on the far ridge. Then he focused. There, a figure barely visible, moving uphill, slow, deliberate. She was alone. "Got something," Ramos breathed. "Far ridge, 2 o'clock. He handed the scope to his second-in-command. The man's eyes narrowed. "That's no local, she's wearing camo. What's left of it?" Ramos made the call instantly. "Split team. Alpha, give me a diversion. Bravo with me." No hesitation. The operators fanned out like shadows. Moments later, A suppressed burst of gunfire echoed from the valley floor. The Taliban patrol turned toward the sound, shouting orders. In that brief chaos, Ramos and two others sprinted up the ridge, boots scraping rock, lungs burning in the cold. When they reached the crest, the figure ahead of them stumbled, fell behind a boulder. Ramos raised his voice just enough to carry. Staff Sergeant Brin, this is Senior Chief Ramos, U.S. Navy. Authenticate. No response. He tried again, slower this time. Halford, this is friendly. Authentication code Delta Charlie Blackbird 27. A long pause, then. Her voice, low, hoarse, cracked from dehydration, but steady. Staff Sergeant Brin, code confirmed. Ramos exhaled for the first time in hours. They moved toward her carefully, weapons low. When she finally stepped from behind the rock, the sight froze them all. She was barely recognizable. Her uniform was torn, stained dark with blood and dirt. Her face was gaunt, lips cracked, eyes hollow but alive. Her left arm hung limp in a sling she'd fashioned from tape and webbing. Her right hand gripped a pistol so tightly her knuckles were white. But she was standing. Jesus, one of the operators whispered. Ramos stepped forward. You're safe now, Sergeant, we've got you. Brin's eyes flicked to his patch, then to the horizon. You shouldn't have come, she murmured. They're close. He didn't ask how she knew. He just nodded once and said, then we move. They supported her as she stumbled, her legs trembling from exhaustion. When she faltered, Ramos lifted her arm over his shoulder. She didn't resist. She just breathed shallowly, staring straight ahead. How long? He asked softly. 23 days, she whispered. He didn't correct her, didn't tell her it had been 21. Numbers didn't matter anymore. They reached the extraction point as dawn bled over the mountains. The valley below was alive now, enemy shouts, scattered gunfire, the echo of engines. Then came the sound they'd been waiting for. Helicopter rotors. The bird dropped low over the ridge, kicking snow into the air. The door gunners opened suppressive fire as the SEALs dragged Brin aboard. Ramos climbed in last. The helicopter banked hard, rising fast, tracer rounds cutting through the air behind them. Brin collapsed against the floor. The medic pressed an oxygen mask to her face, checking vitals, speaking words she couldn't hear. All she could see was the sky, wide, endless, unbelievable. For the first time in 3 weeks, she let her body rest. Ramos watched her quietly. Her eyes fluttered shut, but her hand was still gripping the pistol. He gently pried it from her fingers. "You're home, soldier," he said softly. "You made it." But even as he said it, he knew the truth. Some parts of war don't end when the helicopter lifts off. Sometimes survival is just the beginning. What does home mean when you've already been buried? Brin opened her eyes to white light and silence. The first thing she noticed was the smell, sterile, cold, faintly chemical. The second was the steady beat beside her head, a heart monitor. She tried to move, but her left shoulder locked in pain. Tubes trailed from her arms, and her body felt like it belonged to someone else. The air felt heavy, too clean. She wasn't in Afghanistan anymore. Through blurred vision, she saw a flag patch on the sleeve of the nurse adjusting her IV. U.S. colors. Her throat tightened. She wasn't sure if she should cry or laugh, or if she could even remember how to do either. "You're safe," the nurse said quietly, noticing her eyes open. "You're in Landstuhl, Germany. You've been here for 2 days." Germany. The word didn't feel real. She blinked slowly, her voice cracked. "The team SEALs." The nurse smiled faintly. "They're fine, they saved you." Brin turned her head toward the window. It was early morning, pale light filtering through frost-streaked glass. Snow outside. She thought of the Hindu Kush, how the snow there never looked gentle. Here it looked soft, forgiving. She closed her eyes again, but rest didn't come. Memories flickered, crash, fire, blood, the cold breath of mountains pressing against her ribs. She stopped trusting what was real weeks ago. Now reality itself felt suspicious. Later, when she woke again, a man in uniform stood by her bed. Gray-haired, calm eyes, the look of someone used to bad news. "Staff Sergeant Halford," he said softly, "I'm Colonel Price. I wanted to welcome you back." "Back?" She stared at him. "You already buried me." He exhaled, shame flickering across his features. "Yes, we did, and that's why I'm here. You deserve to know what happened." He took a chair beside her and spoke quietly, like someone walking through broken glass. He explained the identification process, the rush to confirm casualties in hostile terrain, the recovered bodies, the personal effects, the DNA that was supposed to match but didn't. How the remains sent to her mother's home in Oregon belonged to another soldier, killed in a separate ambush. How her name had been carved into stone, while she was still bleeding in the dirt. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "We failed you." Brin looked at him for a long time. Her lips trembled, but her eyes didn't. "You didn't fail me, sir. You failed her, whoever she was." The colonel lowered his gaze. "Her family is being notified," he said. "The record will be corrected. You'll have your ceremony again, this time the right way." Brin let out a slow, bitter breath. "You mean the living ceremony?" He didn't answer. When he left, she stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours. The fluorescent lights hummed softly. She tried to imagine her mother's face when the new call came through, "She's alive." Would she believe it, or would it sound like another mistake in a long list of them? That night, sleep came and went in flashes. Sometimes she was back in the ravine, hearing the sound of boots above her. Sometimes she was at her own funeral, watching from a distance as they folded the flag over her empty coffin. No one looked up. She woke up sweating, gasping, the monitor spiking. A nurse rushed in, calm, practiced. Brin whispered, "I was there, watching." The nurse adjusted the IV without question. "You're safe now." Safe, the word felt useless. In the days that followed, she began physical therapy. Her shoulder had partially healed wrong in the field, so they had to reset it. The pain was worse than the crash. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just bit her lip until it bled and kept her eyes open. The doctors talked about dehydration, malnutrition, infection. They used words like remarkable resilience and unprecedented recovery. She just nodded. None of it mattered. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw a stranger wearing her face, a ghost with pulse and paperwork. On the fourth day, Colonel Price returned, this time with another visitor, a woman in civilian clothes, hair pulled back neatly, eyes red-rimmed from travel. Brin froze. Her mother. For a heartbeat, they just looked at each other. No words, no movement. Then Margaret Halford crossed the room and wrapped her daughter in an embrace so fierce it felt like gravity. "I thought," her mother's voice broke. "They told me." "I know," Brin whispered, her throat closed. "I'm sorry." Margaret pulled back just enough to look at her face. "Don't you ever say sorry for being alive." They both laughed, but it wasn't laughter. It was release, years of silence in one sound. Her mother stayed for days, sleeping in the hospital chair, holding Brin's hand during therapy sessions. She didn't ask much about what happened. She just sat there, brushing her daughter's hair, telling her about the snow back home and how the old dog still slept by the porch. Sometimes silence is the most merciful kind of conversation. But the army wasn't silent. Behind closed doors, the investigation unfolded fast and uncomfortably. The Joint Command reviewed every link in the chain: battlefield reports, medical examiner files, logistics transfers. Someone had to answer for how a living soldier ended up in a coffin and how another family received the wrong body. Whispers spread across Fort Campbell, through intelligence circles and operational briefings. Some called her the ghost sergeant. Others said it was impossible, that she had to be lying, that the signal was faked, that no one could survive 3 weeks in Taliban territory alone. Brin heard the rumors when she returned to the States 2 months later. The transport touched down at Andrews Air Force Base under gray skies. Reporters waited outside the gate, but command kept them back. No interviews, no footage. The Army didn't want a miracle story, they wanted a correction. She understood. Miracles make people question systems. In the rehab center, she learned to walk without a limp again. Her body healed faster than her mind. She could lift weights, jog short distances, smile for photos, but sleep remained a stranger. Every night she'd close her eyes and still see the crash, the snow, the broken helicopter spinning through black air. She'd hear her teammates' voices calling out through static. Sometimes she woke up reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. They said it was trauma. She called it remembering. Weeks passed. A psychologist came daily, young, polite, all empathy and soft language. He asked her how she felt about being declared dead. She stared at him for a long time before answering. "I feel like the system made peace with my absence faster than I did." He didn't know what to say to that. Few people did. When she was finally cleared to leave, command scheduled a small ceremony. They said she didn't have to attend, but she insisted. It wasn't about the medal, it was about standing upright again, alive, undeniable. The day came cold and bright. The flag snapped in the wind outside the administrative building. A handful of officers gathered, the SEAL team who had found her standing quietly in the back. Senior Chief Ramos met her eyes and nodded once. No words necessary. The citation was read aloud. For conspicuous gallantry and unwavering endurance under conditions of extreme isolation and enemy threat. They pinned the silver star to her uniform. Cameras flashed once, twice. She smiled faintly, but inside it felt like watching someone else's life. Afterward, Ramos approached her. "You did something none of us thought possible." Brin shrugged slightly, her arm still stiff in the sling. "I just kept moving." He smiled. "Sometimes that's enough." They stood in silence for a while. She looked at the medal, then at him. "You know, they say survival's the easy part, but I think they've got it backward." Ramos nodded slowly. "Yeah, coming back's harder." That night, she walked alone along the fence line of the base. The sun dipped behind the trees, and the wind carried the faint sound of a bugle playing somewhere in the distance. The same song they'd played for her 3 weeks after she died. She stopped walking, closed her eyes. It felt strange to be alive in a world that had already mourned her. To feel the weight of that flag folded and handed to her mother, knowing it had been meant for her. Some things don't have words. She whispered to the wind, not knowing if anyone or anything was listening. "If there's meaning in this, let it be quiet." Back in her room, she placed the medal on the table beside her dog tags. She stared at them for a long time, then slipped both into a drawer. They didn't feel like trophies. They felt like proof of something she didn't need to explain. The next morning, she signed her retirement papers, medically cleared but emotionally finished. She flew home to Oregon the following week. Her mother met her at the airport, holding a thermos of coffee and a quiet smile. No cameras, no speeches, just mountains on the horizon. The drive back to the foothills was long and silent. The pines blurred past, their shadows stretching across the road like memories. When they reached the old house, her mother stopped the car. "Your grandfather's cabin still stands," she said softly. "Roof leaks, but it's yours if you want it." Brin looked toward the ridge, saw smoke rising faintly from the chimney where she'd learned to track elk and build fires. She nodded. "Yeah, I'll fix it." And she did. It took weeks, replacing beams, clearing snow, chopping wood, but she did it all herself. She found peace in the rhythm of work, in the scrape of nails, the smell of pine, the way silence here didn't feel like punishment anymore. Sometimes, at night, she'd sit outside under the stars. the same stars she'd followed through the Hindu Kush, the same constellations her grandfather had taught her to read. And she'd think of those 3 weeks, the hunger, the fear, the promise she made to herself. Some stories don't end with heroism or closure. They end quietly, like a slow exhale after too long holding your breath. Brin never spoke publicly about what happened. She didn't need to. The people who mattered already knew. And for her, that was enough. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. How long can someone live in peace before the past comes knocking? Brin Halford had learned to live quietly. The mountains around her mother's home in Oregon carried a silence that didn't demand anything from her. The kind of silence that could either heal or haunt. It depended on the day. The cabin sat high in the Cascades, just below the snow line, surrounded by fir and cedar. It was old. Her grandfather's hands had built it decades before she was born, but it stood like a memory that refused to fade. She'd fixed it slowly, replaced the roof, reinforced the beams, restored the porch rail that her grandfather had carved with initials and dates. Work kept her grounded. She liked the weight of a hammer, the sound of nails, the ache in her muscles at night. Sometimes she'd hike out past the creek, tracing the trails she'd learned as a girl. Her body had healed mostly. The shoulder still stiffened in the cold, but she didn't complain. Pain was just another language she understood now. People from town left her alone. They'd heard the story in fragments, the soldier they buried twice, the one who came back. Rumors travel faster than truth, and in small towns they don't die easily. Some wanted to meet her, shake her hand, thank her. She always declined politely. She didn't need strangers' awe. She needed quiet. The VA had offered her therapy, interviews, even a book deal through some military journalist who wanted to capture the miracle. She said no to all of it. She wasn't a miracle. She was a mistake corrected too late. But there were moments when she missed the noise, the sound of radios, the low murmur of soldiers before a mission, the rhythm of a world where purpose was simple. Live, protect, return. Here, purpose was slower. It took the shape of small things, feeding the stray dog that started showing up each morning, fixing her mother's fence, planting a small garden that never quite grew straight. And yet, even as she tried to fade into simplicity, the war lingered. It always does. At night, she sometimes woke to the sound of rotors, not real ones, the memory kind. In her mind, the helicopter was still falling, blades screaming, smoke turning the sky black. She'd wake with her hands clenched, breath ragged, heart hammering. Then she'd remind herself where she was. Home, she'd whisper to the dark, "You're home." But the word never fully settled. Her mother worried. She tried not to show it, but mothers never stop worrying, especially about soldiers who have already come back once from the dead. She'd stop by every few days with groceries, pretending it was casual. "Just in the area," she'd say, setting down a bag of fruit she knew Brin wouldn't eat. Brin would smile. "You live 15 miles away, Mom." Margaret would shrug. "Then it's a big area." They'd sit on the porch drinking coffee, talking about anything except the war. Weather, old neighbors, the state of the highway. Margaret knew better than to ask about Afghanistan. She'd seen it in her daughter's eyes, that faraway stillness that never fully came back from deployment. One evening, late in November, Brin was splitting wood when she heard it, 3 knocks on the cabin door. Firm, measured, military. She froze, axe halfway down. No one she knew knocked like that. When she opened the door, 2 men stood there. Civilian clothes, clean haircuts, posture too straight to hide what they were. One carried a folder. "Staff Sergeant Halford," the taller one asked. She hesitated. "Not anymore." He gave a polite half-smile. "Mind if we come in?" Her stomach tightened. "That depends who you're with." "Department of Defense, Counterintelligence Branch." She stepped aside slowly. "You've got a strange sense of timing. I retired a year ago." The man nodded. We're aware this isn't about reactivation, it's about a case. They sat at the small kitchen table. The second man opened the folder and slid a photo across the wood. A face, burned, scarred, but identifiable enough. Brin's chest went cold. This man, the agent said, was one of the insurgents recovered near the wreckage of your last mission. His body was found last month outside Kunar province. Alongside him, we recovered a U.S. military beacon, modified, reprogrammed. The same encryption pattern as yours. Brin stared at the photo without touching it. Her voice was quiet, so someone cloned my signal. Looks that way. The taller agent leaned forward. We need to know if you shared beacon protocol access with anyone, or if there's any possibility that someone from your team might have been compromised before the crash. Brin didn't answer immediately. She looked out the window instead, where the pine shadows stretched long over the snow. Both of my teammates were dead before sunrise, she said finally. If anyone was compromised, it wasn't them. The agent studied her expression. We're reopening the incident file. The initial assumption was simple misidentification, but the recovered beacon suggests something more deliberate. A diversion, maybe. Brin's jaw tightened. You think someone wanted me listed as dead? The silence that followed was an answer on its own. They left her with a contact card and a quiet warning. If anything or anyone reaches out about your deployment, call us first. After they were gone, the cabin felt smaller. The stillness she'd built began to shift, restless. She couldn't stop staring at the photo. That face, she remembered it not clearly but enough. A villager who'd once guided their team across a valley months before the crash. He'd been friendly, smiled often, knew too much. She trusted him once. Now he was dead with her signal in his pocket. That night she couldn't sleep. The wind outside moaned through the trees, sounding too much like a helicopter rotor fatting into distance. By morning she'd packed a small rucksack, old habits, extra batteries, map, knife, compass. She told herself it was nothing, that she just wanted to hike the ridge, clear her head. But deep down, she knew it wasn't about hiking. It was about control, about reminding herself she wasn't the ghost they buried. She hiked for hours, through melting snow and mist. The air bit cold and clean. Every tree creak sounded like an echo from the mountains overseas. When she finally stopped to rest, she sat on a fallen log and stared at the valley below. It was quiet, peaceful, ordinary. And yet in the back of her mind, she could still feel that encrypted pulse, the 11-second beacon that had changed everything. For weeks after, she tried to ignore it, tried to bury the visit like another classified memory. But once the past cracks open, it never closes cleanly. Sometimes she'd wake at dawn with a feeling she couldn't name, a pull, a warning. Once she found footprints near the edge of her property, too heavy for wildlife, too precise. She told herself it was nothing, hunters maybe, hikers. But the old instincts didn't agree. A week later she received a letter, no return address, no stamp, just left on her porch under a flat rock. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, taken through a scope. It showed her cabin from a distance, and beneath it 3 words written in block letters. Not finished yet. Brin stood on the porch for a long time, wind cutting through the trees, the paper trembling in her hand. Something deep in her chest, something she'd buried with her uniform, woke up again. She burned the letter in the fire pit that night, watching the flames consume every trace of it. But even after the ashes cooled, the words still burned behind her eyes. Not finished yet. She didn't call the agents. She didn't tell her mother. Some part of her, the soldier part, didn't want help. She wanted answers. Maybe the war wasn't done with her. Or maybe she thought it never would be. Over the next few days, she began to prepare without admitting it to herself. She cleaned her old sidearm, checked her gear, walked the perimeter of the property at night. The forest no longer felt like peace. It felt like cover. And yet part of her almost welcomed it, because fear, at least, was familiar. It reminded her she was still alive. Late one night, she sat by the window, mug of coffee cooling beside her. The moonlight fell across her hands, tracing the scars that never quite faded. She remembered Ramos's words at the extraction site, "You made it home." But what if home wasn't a place? What if it was just the space between battles? She set the mug down, leaned back and whispered into the empty room, "If you're coming, come fast." Outside, the forest answered with silence. For now, because somewhere beyond those mountains, someone else was moving too, watching, waiting, carrying a signal that was never meant to exist. And Brin Halford, the woman who'd once been buried alive by mistake, was about to learn that survival had a sequel. What do you do when the war you escaped comes looking for you again? Brin Halford hadn't slept for 3 nights, not deeply anyway. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of wind outside felt like a whisper of movement. She told herself she was overreacting, paranoia left over from the desert, but that didn't explain the footprints, or the letter, or the way the woods went too quiet after dark. On the 4th night, she made a decision she had promised herself she never would. She went back into her old footlocker. It sat beneath her bed, still sealed with a dull metal latch. The smell that escaped when she opened it was part dust, part memory, gun oil, canvas, faint traces of sand she could never wash away. Inside were fragments of her other life, the folded uniform she'd worn before the crash, her battered notebook full of codes and fragments, the silver star medal still in its velvet box. At the bottom lay her field knife and her beacon. She picked it up slowly, thumb tracing the scratches along its casing. The same one that had saved her life, the same one someone had copied. Not finished yet. The words from the letter echoed through her mind. Whoever had left it knew where she lived. That meant this wasn't random. This was deliberate, personal. She slid the beacon into her pocket and locked the trunk again. Then she turned off every light in the cabin. If they were watching, she didn't want to give them an easy view. Outside, the forest was silvered with moonlight. The trees swayed softly, whispering like an old language she'd once known. She moved quietly, the way her grandfather had taught her, slow, measured steps, avoiding dry branches, keeping her breath shallow. She circled the property once, then twice. Nothing, just the sound of an owl somewhere high above. But as she passed the creek bed on the 3rd loop, she froze. Something caught the light, barely visible, half buried in mud. A casing, rifle caliber, fresh. She crouched, fingers brushing the brass, still warm. She lifted her eyes toward the tree line. "All right," she whispered softly, "so it's like that." She didn't go back inside, not yet. Instead, she moved deeper into the woods, following instinct. 10 minutes, then 20. The cold air sharpened her senses until everything felt too loud, her breath, her heartbeat, the rustle of pine needles. Then faintly she heard it, movement. Someone was there. She dropped low, steadying herself behind a fallen trunk. Her hand found the handle of her knife. She waited, silent. A shape emerged through the trees. A man, wearing dark clothes, carrying something slung over his shoulder. His pace was cautious, scanning the ground with a flashlight angled low. Brin watched him move, the way his boots landed, military trained. He wasn't a hunter. He reached a small clearing near her property fence, then stopped, pulled something from his pocket, a small device. It beeped faintly, a receiver. Her stomach tightened. He was looking for a signal. Her signal. Brin exhaled slowly and stepped from behind the trunk, voice sharp and controlled. "You've got 10 seconds to explain why you're trespassing." The man spun, flashlight flaring in her eyes. She moved before he could think, closed the distance, grabbed his wrist, twisted. The device fell. He grunted, tried to pull free, but she drove her knee into his ribs and pinned him against the tree. Who sent you? She hissed. He froze, pain etched across his face. You're Halford. The sound of her name from a stranger's mouth made her skin crawl. Answer me. He swallowed hard. They said you'd find me. That stopped her cold. They. But before he could answer, a gunshot split the air. The man jerked, eyes wide, then collapsed. Brin hit the ground behind the tree as a second shot cracked through the clearing. The sound came from somewhere high, ridge line, maybe 200 meters away. Suppressed, professional. She pressed a hand to the fallen man's neck. No pulse. Her eyes darted to the device he'd dropped. It was cracked but still glowing faintly. On the screen, tracking active. Whoever had killed him hadn't aimed for her. They'd silenced him. She grabbed the device, pocketed it, and slipped back into the shadows, moving fast and low. Every nerve screamed for caution. Whoever was out there was trained and patient. She didn't stop until she reached the cabin again. She killed the porch light, locked the door, and moved to the back room where her old field radio sat on a shelf. She hadn't turned it on in months. But now she flipped the switch. Static filled the room. She adjusted the frequency to a range she hadn't used since Afghanistan, a secure channel once assigned to her old unit, just in case. Echo 5-9, this is Sierra November 4-1, she said quietly. If anyone's monitoring, I have potential contact at rural Cascade sector. Possible threat. Respond. Silence. She repeated the call twice. Nothing. Then, after nearly a full minute, a voice cracked through the static. Copy that, Sierra November 4-1. Identify. Her heart stuttered. That voice. Ramos. There was a pause, then a breath of disbelief. Halford, Jesus Christ, I thought, how the hell did you get this frequency? She almost laughed, the absurdity cutting through the tension. Old habits. What's your situation? Unknown hostile near my property. Confirmed armed. One additional contact down. Possible surveillance or beacon trace. Ramos cursed under his breath. Stay put. You're not alone out there, are you? She hesitated. No backup, not anymore. He didn't like that answer. I can have someone there by morning. Keep comms open. Don't engage again. But Brin already knew she wouldn't wait for morning. She spent 3 weeks once waiting for rescue. Never again. She killed the radio and sat in silence, staring at the device she'd taken from the dead man. The display flickered, showing faint coordinates. North Ridge, the same direction the shot had come from. She tightened her jaw. If they were watching her, she'd end it on her terms. At dawn, she geared up. Old field jacket, sidearm, boots that had seen better days. She left a note for her mother just in case, a short one. Gone hiking, don't worry. Then she followed the trail north. The ridge was steep and slick with frost. She moved slowly, careful not to leave tracks too easy to follow. The air grew colder the higher she climbed. Halfway up, she found signs of a camp, ashes, fresh footprints, a small tarp caught in the brush. Someone had been here recently. She crouched low, scanning the slope. Then she saw it, a faint glint of glass near the rocks, a scope, a sniper's perch. Her pulse quickened. She approached carefully, weapon drawn. The area was empty now, but whoever had been here had watched her cabin for days. She could feel it. The angle was perfect. Direct line of sight to her front porch. She found a single casing beside the rock, same caliber as the one from the creek. So they'd shot him from here, silenced him, then vanished. But there was something else, a small scrap of fabric wedged between stones. She pulled it free and froze. It wasn't random. It was military issue, patterned with the same desert camouflage her unit used. Not Taliban, not locals. Someone from her own side. She stared at the cloth for a long time, her breath fogging in the cold. The mountain wind whispered through the trees, carrying a faint echo of memory. 3 weeks alone in the Hindu Kush. No rescue, no explanation. Maybe that had never been an accident. She pocketed the scrap and started back down the ridge, mind racing. If someone inside the system wanted her erased back then, what would stop them from finishing the job now, quietly off the record? Back at the cabin, she called Ramos again. "Talk to me," he said immediately. "I found the shooter's nest. U.S. camo, no insignia, whoever they are, they're trained and clean." He swore softly, "I'll handle this." "No, you won't," she said firmly. "If this came from inside, I'm not dragging anyone else into it. Halford, I'm done being a file people read after I'm gone. I'm finding out who did this." She cut the transmission. Ramos cursed again, but the line was dead. Outside, the sun was setting, streaking the sky with amber light. Brin loaded her pack with essentials: water, rations, a map, the beacon. She didn't know where she'd go yet, only that the answer was out there. She looked once at the photo, still burned into her memory. The insurgent with her signal, the proof that someone had moved pieces she didn't see. Then she whispered to herself, calm, steady, "This time I'm not running, I'm hunting." The mountains swallowed her silhouette as the first snow began to fall. And somewhere deep in the cold distance, another beacon pulsed faintly, brief, encrypted, deliberate. Waiting for her. How do you hunt ghosts when you've already been one? The trail north cut through canyons and fog. Brin Halford moved with purpose, each step a return to instincts she thought she'd left behind. The air was thin and sharp, the kind that scraped the lungs clean. Every sound mattered: the rustle of branches, the crunch of frost underfoot, the wind slipping through pine needles like whispers. She'd hiked these ridges before, but not like this, not as prey turned predator. Her compass needle quivered under the gray dawn light, pointing toward coordinates she'd pulled from the dead man's receiver. The numbers didn't lie. Someone had been transmitting from deep inside the forest, using the same encryption pattern that once belonged to her. The same pulse that had saved her life was now being used to stalk it. As she moved deeper into the wilderness, memories began to bleed through the silence. The crash, the smoke, the smell of burning hydraulic fluid, the sound of her own breathing through the pain. For 3 weeks she'd crawled through terrain that wanted her gone, and now, back home, safe, healed, she was crawling again. Some lessons don't fade. By midday, the trail grew narrow and the slope steeper. A thin stream wound through the rocks, the water cold enough to sting her hands. She crouched and drank, eyes scanning the tree line. Movement. Not much, just a flicker, a shadow crossing too deliberately to be animal. Her instincts whispered, they're not watching from afar anymore. She stood, slipped into the cover of brush, and moved parallel to the stream. Every muscle was alert. The air felt heavier, weighted with awareness. Then she saw it, a small signal antenna half buried under snow, its wires camouflaged with leaves. It wasn't broadcasting now, but it had been, recently. She knelt beside it, tracing the serial number etched into the metal. Her heart stuttered. U.S. military property, not black market, not foreign. Her radio crackled faintly, just static at first, then a whisper of a voice. "Halford, if you're hearing this, don't follow." "Ramos." But the signal was weak, distorted. She turned the gain up, adjusting dials until his voice sharpened through the noise. "Repeat, do not pursue. You've been flagged by someone above my clearance. Intel says your file been reopened under Section 12. That means Black Operations Authority. They're not investigating you, Brin. They're cleaning up." Her breath caught. "Say that again." The radio hissed, then cut to silence. She stared at it for a long time, wind biting her face, thoughts spiraling. Cleaning up. Someone in the system had erased her once before, declared her dead, buried the truth, and replaced it with a story that fit the narrative. And now they were doing it again. She packed the radio and kept moving, north. The forest grew darker, thicker. By evening, she found a clearing with remnants of a camp, ashes still warm, ration wrappers scattered in the dirt, the faint smell of burnt coffee. Someone had left in a hurry. She crouched near the fire pit, gloved fingers brushing over a crushed patch of snow where a boot had slipped. Deep tread, issue pattern, Navy or Army. She reached for her sidearm. "Easy," a voice said from behind. She spun, gun raised, but the figure in front of her didn't flinch. Senior Chief Ramos. He was older, wearier, wrapped in cold-weather gear, rifle slung low. His eyes carried the same steady calm they always had. "Stand down," he said quietly. "I told you not to come here." Brin did lower the gun right away. "You've been following me." He nodded once. "Because they're following you." Her grip loosened slightly. "You said they're cleaning up. What does that mean exactly?" He exhaled, breath fogging in the air. "It means someone high up doesn't want questions about your mission reopened. The beacon cloning, the false ID, the body switch, it's all tied together. There was an intelligence breach during your last op, and you were never supposed to survive to tell anyone about it." Brin stared at him, disbelief warring with fury. "You're saying my death was intentional?" Ramos didn't look away. "I'm saying it was convenient." She lowered the weapon slowly, her pulse a drumbeat in her ears. "So who ordered it?" "That's what I've been trying to find out." He glanced toward the tree line, scanning the horizon. 2 nights ago, someone hit one of our secure storage units at Pendleton. Files gone. Names, logs, everything related to your op. Whoever did this knows we're close." Brin clenched her jaw. "Then we're not running." He shook his head. "You don't understand. This isn't Afghanistan. You can't just disappear again. They'll find you." She stepped closer. "They already have. What's the difference?" For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind whispered through the trees like a warning. Finally, Ramos said, "There's a cabin 3 clicks north. Safe house. Old JSOC fallback point. We'll rest there, plan next steps." Brin hesitated, then nodded. They moved in silence, weaving through trees until dusk turned to deep blue. The cabin was small, built into the hillside, half hidden by rock and moss. Ramos unlocked it with a key he'd kept since his service days. Inside, the air smelled of dust and fuel oil. Maps, radio gear, emergency rations, all standard. She dropped her pack and sank onto a chair. "You kept this all these years." He gave a small smile. "Old habits like you." They ate in silence for a while, the only sound the crackle of the small fire he'd lit in the stove. After a while, Brin said quietly, "You think someone inside command sold us out?" Ramos's eyes darkened. "I think someone inside command needed a cover-up. The beacon that saved you shouldn't have been active. It was meant to draw attention away from another operation running parallel to yours, one that went bad. You weren't supposed to survive long enough to complicate it." Brin looked down at her hands, scarred, trembling slightly. 3 weeks alone in the Hindu Kush, all that time. I thought I was the one who made it out by luck." He studied her face. "You did. Luck, training, sheer will, it doesn't matter. You weren't supposed to be alive, and that scares them." The fire crackled between them, throwing shadows against the walls. Finally, Brin said, "Then let's make them afraid for a reason." Ramos raised an eyebrow. "You planning something?" She reached into her pocket and placed the cloned beacon on the table. "I think it's time we send our own signal." He stared at it, then smiled faintly. "You always did know how to bait a trap." By dawn, they had a plan. They'd power the cloned beacon briefly, just long enough to make whoever was tracking her think they'd found their mark. Then they'd trace the response signal and follow it to its source. The hunter becomes the hunted. They set up near a ridge overlooking a frozen lake, concealed by dense timber. Ramos handled the satellite link while Brin calibrated the beacon, fingers steady despite the cold. "You ready for this?" he asked quietly. She nodded. They came to finish a story, Let's give them an ending they didn't write. He flicked the switch. The beacon pulsed once, twice, 11 seconds just like before. Then silence. They waited 10 minutes 15. Then Ramos's screen flickered. Got something. Uplink trace pinged from 40 miles east, abandoned relay tower near old logging road. Brin checked her weapon. Let's go. Ramos hesitated. You sure you're ready for whatever's at the end of this? She looked out at the horizon where clouds rolled low over the peaks. I've been dead before. I'm ready for anything. They packed light and moved fast. By evening, they reached the outskirts of the old tower. The structure loomed against the sky, steel skeleton half-collapsed, rusted, cables dangling like veins. Brin crouched behind a rock, scanning through binoculars. A single vehicle sat near the base. Black SUV, no markings. Looks empty, Ramos murmured. Nothing's ever empty, she said. They approached from the north slope, using the terrain for cover. As they neared the tower, a door creaked open. A figure stepped out, coat drawn tight, holding a tablet. Civilian, but not ordinary. Ramos whispered, recognition ping, Lang, NSA contractor. He was on the intercept team that reviewed your signal 3 years ago. Brin's pulse quickened. Then he's our link. They moved closer, silent as breath. But before they could close the distance, Lang looked up, straight toward them. He smiled, not surprised. Been waiting, Sergeant Halford, he called out. You really don't know when to quit. Ramos raised his weapon, hands where I can see them. Lang chuckled, still taking orders from Ghost's chief. He tapped something on the tablet. A faint beep echoed across the snow. Brin's blood ran cold. Ramos, she whispered, it's a trap. An explosion ripped through the base of the tower. The shockwave threw them both backward, snow and metal raining down in a blinding roar. When Brin opened her eyes, her ears rang, the world a haze of smoke and ash. She pushed up on shaking hands, coughing. The SUV burned 30 feet away. Ramos, she shouted. No answer. She crawled through debris, vision blurring. A figure moved in the smoke, Lang limping, half his face burned but alive. He saw her and grinned weakly. You were supposed to stay dead. Brin raised her weapon. You first. He laughed once, ragged. You think this ends with me? You were a test case, a mistake that proved the system works. She hesitated. What system? He smiled faintly, eyes glassy, the kind that buries truth before it breathes. Then he fell. Brin stood over him, the snow melting under their boots, the sky bleeding red with dawn. Somewhere behind her, Ramos groaned, alive barely. She looked at the horizon, at the rising smoke, at the beacon still flickering faintly in her hand. For the first time since the crash, she didn't feel lost. She felt certain. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about revelation. What do you do when the truth you've chased finally looks back at you? The air was heavy with smoke and silence. The explosion had ripped the world apart, leaving only the ringing in Brin Halford's ears and the pounding of her heart. She knelt beside Ramos, checking for breath, pulse, movement. His eyelids flickered. I'm fine, he rasped. You? She nodded, though her hands were shaking. The snow around them was black with soot, the steel bones of the tower still smoldering. Lang's body lay a few yards away, half covered in debris. Ramos struggled to sit up. We need to move. Someone will come to clean this up fast. Brin crouched beside Lang's body, searching his pockets. She found a phone, cracked, scorched, but still glowing faintly. The screen was locked behind encryption, but a single notification blinked through the haze. Data transfer complete. She frowned. He sent something before the detonation. To who? Ramos asked. Let's find out. They stumbled back through the woods, moving slow, every muscle protesting. By the time they reached the safe house again, the sky was turning dark. Brin powered up the satellite link, connecting the phone to the secure line. The screen flickered. A list of encrypted transfers appeared, most of them dead endpoints except one, a live connection pinging a server based in DC. Ramos leaned over her shoulder. Lang wasn't acting alone. Then we followed the line. It took nearly an hour to bypass the security layers, Brin's fingers steady even as her vision blurred from exhaustion. The encryption pattern was familiar, military but modified. She recognized the structure. Joint Command Routing Protocol, she murmured. Classified tier. Someone at top level authorized this. She opened the final log. The screen filled with reports, dozens of them. Her name appeared again and again. Halford Brin M., status deceased, case closed, but each entry was tagged with hidden metadata, Project Meridian. Ramos frowned, never heard of it. Brin scrolled further. Embedded in the logs were mission records, casualty lists, beacon data, all showing minor errors corrected post-mortem. Names of soldiers who died under suspiciously similar circumstances. Declared dead, buried, cases sealed. She whispered, they've been rewriting deaths. Ramos's face hardened. Why? She found the answer in the metadata attached to the files, funding codes, cross-agency tags, authorization initials. Each case was tied to covert operations where outcomes didn't match intelligence expectations. Missions that went bad, sources compromised, collateral too ugly to explain. They're cleaning history, she said quietly, turning real people into placeholders for mistakes. Ramos stared at the screen. And you? I was one of them. My death covered something bigger. He shook his head slowly. No wonder Lang said you were a test case. If they could fake one death and bury it under protocol, they could bury anything. Brin sat back, her chest tight. The fire in the stove crackled softly, its warmth feeling foreign in the cold truth that filled the room. Lang said the system works. Ramos nodded grimly. Yeah, for them. Brin stood and walked to the window. Snow was falling again, gentle this time, coating the world in temporary innocence. She thought of all the soldiers she'd known, names etched on memorial walls, stories finished too soon. How many were real? How many rewritten to fit a cleaner narrative? She turned back. We have to expose this. Ramos hesitated. That won't be easy. If this goes public, it's not just command, it's the whole intelligence chain. They'll burn us both before we get within a mile of a reporter. Brin's eyes met his. Then we don't go to reporters. He frowned. Then where? Someone inside. Someone who still remembers what duty's supposed to mean. She opened the directory files and scanned the chain of authorization. One name appeared repeatedly, initialed on every Project Meridian report. Colonel Nathan Price. Ramos's jaw clenched. That's the same colonel who debriefed you after Germany. Brin felt something twist inside her chest. He looked her in the eye, apologized for the mistake, told her she was safe. And all along, he'd been signing off on the lies. She shut the laptop slowly. Then we start with him. Ramos nodded grim. We'll need transport, disguise, and luck. Brin gave a thin smile. I've been living on luck for years. By dawn, they were on the road, driving east in an old pickup with half its paint gone. The radio stayed off. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind forged only by shared survival. At times, Brin caught herself staring out the window, watching the pines blur into gray distance. She wondered how many times Price had sat behind a desk, typing her name into reports that told the world she was dead. She wasn't angry anymore, not exactly. What she felt was colder, focused. By the second night, they reached a safe drop in Spokane, where an old contact of Ramos's, a former comms tech named Tessa, still owed him favors. She let them in without a word, eyes scanning their faces, then the blood on Brin's sleeve. You two look like ghosts, she muttered. Brin gave a faint smile. Close enough. They used Tessa's secure network to pull the rest of the Project Meridian data. The deeper they dug, the clearer the pattern became. Dozens of soldiers, every branch, everyone declared dead after missions involving failed intel sources or compromised ops. But one file stood out. Brin clicked it open. Inside was a transcript of her final mission report, rewritten in Price's name. It claimed her team had been investigating a compromised informant linked to internal asset corruption. The report concluded with casualty confirmation, necessary to preserve operational integrity. She felt the words hit like a physical blow. Necessary. He'd known. Her team hadn't just been left behind, they'd been sacrificed. The source they were supposed to meet had been a setup. And when things went bad, Price had erased them to protect the operation's reputation. She stared at the screen, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't just sign the reports, he ordered them. Ramos's expression hardened. Then it's time he answers for it. They left before dawn, driving south toward D.C. It took 2 days, each mile a quiet reckoning. The highway lights blurred past like ghosts, the silence heavy but not empty. When they reached the city, Brin felt something she hadn't in a long time: clarity. Price's office was in a secure intelligence building just outside the Beltway. Brin had been there before, years ago, during debriefings. She remembered the smell of polished floors, the cold faces of men who made decisions from safety. They entered through the service corridor, using badges Tessa had forged from old access templates. Inside, the hum of fluorescent light was almost soothing. When they reached Price's office, Brin didn't knock. She opened the door. He looked up, startled for only a second before recognition set in. Brin. She shut the door behind her. You lied to me. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. You shouldn't be here. Neither should I, she said coldly. According to your files, I'm still dead. His expression didn't change. You don't understand the scale of what was at stake. Then explain it to me. He stood, straightening his uniform. Project Meridian was damage control. Operations went bad, sources were compromised, lives were lost. If those details reached the public, entire networks would collapse. We couldn't let that happen. So you buried people alive. He met her eyes, unflinching. We corrected the record. You were one of the few who didn't stay buried. Brin took a step forward, voice low and trembling with restrained anger. You signed my death certificate. Yes, he said softly, because you weren't supposed to survive. The words hung between them like gunpowder. Ramos stepped forward, hand hovering near his holster. You set her team up. That's what this was about. You needed a scapegoat to hide a compromised source. Price's tone stayed calm, almost pitying. You think any of this is personal. It's protocol. We trade lives for stability every day. That's the cost of keeping the machine running. Brin's voice cracked raw. You don't get to call that stability. He looked at her for a long time, then said, You're a good soldier, Halford, but you were never supposed to see the gears turn. Her hand tightened around the beacon in her pocket, the same device that had betrayed and saved her all at once. Then let me return the favor, she said quietly. She set it on his desk and pressed the transmitter. A small light blinked red. What did you just do? He asked, his calm finally cracking. Activated a live feed, she said. Tessa, been recording this entire conversation. Everything you said, every name you dropped. It's already being uploaded to a secure network. You wanted history cleaned, too late. For the first time, Colonel Price looked afraid. Brin stepped back, her voice steady. You buried me once. This time you get to live with it. She turned and walked out, Ramos following close behind. The hallway lights glared white and cold, but for the first time she didn't feel small beneath them. Outside, the city hummed with indifferent life. Cars, people, routine. The world went on, unaware that a ghost had just dragged a truth back from its grave. Ramos looked at her. What now? Brin stared at the horizon where the sky was starting to lighten. Now, we disappear again. He nodded slowly. And the truth? She smiled faintly, eyes tired but alive. The truth doesn't need us to speak. It just needs us not to stop. They walked together into the dawn, their footsteps fading beneath the hum of a world that would soon have to reckon with its own reflection. What does peace look like after everything burns down? For Brin Halford, it wasn't medals or news reports or the justice that headlines love to claim. It was a cabin, a field of snow, the sound of wind through pine needles, and silence, honest, earned silence. 3 months had passed since D.C., since the confrontation, since she walked out of Colonel Price's office and watched the machine start to choke on its own secrets. She hadn't seen Ramos since that morning. They'd separated cleanly, the way soldiers do when the mission ends and both know they might never cross paths again. No ceremony, no goodbye, just understanding. He disappeared south, she went north. The recordings Tessa uploaded had detonated like truth bombs across command networks. Price was suspended within days. Investigations followed, long, quiet ones that unfolded behind closed doors, with words like unauthorized operations, data falsification, and improper casualty documentation. They called it a review. Brin called it a reckoning. For the first time in years, her name wasn't followed by KIA. But none of it brought her peace. She hadn't wanted revenge, just to stop the lie from spreading further, to keep one more family from getting a folded flag and a story that wasn't true. Now that it was over, she wasn't sure what to do with herself. The snow outside her cabin stretched unbroken, a white silence over everything. Morning light cut through the trees, spilling gold over the porch where she sat wrapped in her grandfather's old coat, a mug of coffee cooling in her hands. The war felt far away now, but sometimes when the wind shifted, it came back in fragments: the smell of rotor wash, the crack of gunfire, the cold ache of isolation. She didn't fight those memories anymore. She let them come, let them pass, the way you let waves break over your feet without trying to stop the tide. A truck rumbled up the dirt road sometime after noon. She didn't move at first. Nobody came out this far. Then a familiar voice called out, "You planning to make me freeze out here, Sergeant?" She smiled before she even saw him. Ramos stepped out of the truck, same calm posture, same quiet weight in his eyes. He looked older now. They both did. She gestured to the porch. "Didn't think you'd find this place." He shrugged. "Wasn't hard, you left a trail of ghosts." He handed her a folded envelope. The seal was government. She frowned. "Please tell me this isn't another summons." He shook his head. "It's over, officially. The investigation wrapped last week. Price took the fall, but they're still pretending it was a limited oversight." Brin laughed softly. Limited oversight. That's one way to describe burying the living. He didn't smile. "You should know something else. Tessa's off-grid, burned her network. She said to tell you some truths travel better in silence." Brin nodded quiet. That sounded like Tessa. They sat on the porch for a long time, watching the snow drift down. Ramos finally asked, "You ever think about going back? Not the army, just back to that part of yourself?" She looked out at the mountains. "Every day, but I think some people aren't meant to return. They're meant to remember." He nodded. "You made them remember too." She didn't answer. The truth wasn't about medals or justice. It was about faces, the ones she'd served with, the ones she couldn't save, the ones whose stories might finally be told correctly. After Ramos left, the cabin felt both emptier and lighter. She stood by the window, watching his truck disappear into the trees. For a while, she thought about following him, about staying connected to the fight that had given her life its edge. But then she looked down at her hands, the same hands that had held weapons, tended wounds and built walls. She'd done enough fighting. That evening she took a walk up the ridge behind the cabin. The trail was steep, but she knew every turn. The wind cut cold against her cheeks, but it felt real, honest. The kind of pain that reminded her she was alive. At the top, she reached the overlook where her grandfather used to sit and watch the sun disappear behind the pines. From up there, the valley stretched for miles, a frozen ocean of trees and light. She closed her eyes and listened. No rotors, no radio chatter, just wind and heartbeat. She thought of her teammates, their laughter before the mission, the quiet confidence that came from trust. She carried their dog tags in her pack ever since the crash. Now she took them out one by one. The metal was cold in her palm. "I told you I wouldn't quit," she whispered. Then she hung the tags on a branch overlooking the valley. The wind stirred them, soft clinks echoing like chimes. That sound felt more like peace than anything she'd known in years. The next morning, she sat at her kitchen table and began to write. Not a report, not a statement, just words. Her story the way it really happened, for no one and everyone. She wrote about the crash, the cold, the hunger. About what it felt like to keep walking when the world had already decided you were gone. She wrote about fear, not as weakness, but as proof of humanity. And she wrote about the promise she made to herself, the one that carried her through the dark. To keep moving. To never let silence mean surrender. Hours passed, the fire burned low, the pages filled. When she finally stopped, the last light of evening painted the room in gold. She closed the notebook gently and looked at it for a long time. It wasn't for publication. It wasn't for history. It was for her and maybe, someday, for someone who needed to know that survival doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like persistence. She stepped outside, the cold air crisp against her face. The dog from town, the same stray that had followed her since autumn, waited at the porch steps. "You again," she murmured, smiling. "Guess we're both strays now." She poured him a little food, then sat beside him, staring at the stars just beginning to emerge. For the first time, she felt no need to run, no need to hide. The story was out there now. The truth had found its voice. Somewhere far away, in an office full of polished steel and silent screens, someone was probably already rewriting the narrative, sanding the edges, dulling the truth, finding new words for old lies. But Brin didn't care. Because truth, once spoken, has a way of echoing. She leaned back, watching the night sky stretch infinite and alive. Each star, a point of persistence, small but impossible to erase. Her voice broke the silence softly. "You can bury names, but not what they stood for." The dog tilted its head, as if listening. Brin smiled faintly. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The wind picked up, carrying her words into the valley, scattering them like sparks over the snow. Inside, the fire burned steady. Her notebook sat open on the table, the last page still drying with ink. The words were simple but final. They buried her once, but not even the earth could hold the living truth. And as dawn began to rise again over the ridges, the world felt new. Not redeemed, not repaired, but honest. And sometimes that's enough.